BioStrategy Partners is a nonprofit consortium dedicated to the transfer of academic research into the marketplace. We are also committed to the ongoing education of faculty and graduate students about the commercialization and technology transfer process. We would like to give a special thank you to our sponsors today, MVM Associates and Caesar Revies Intellectual Property Law, and also to our host, University Place Associates. And now I'll turn you over to Nick Spring, the moderator of today's panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Erica, and good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Nick Spring. I'll be introducing this panel, and we're looking today at something I think very, very relevant and important and core to our overall business, and that's the importance of clinical trial design. We've got a great panel, and I'm very excited and privileged to be presenting today. We have Diane, Mike, and Bob. So, without any further ado, I'd just like to hand it over and ask Mike to please introduce yourself.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here as well. My name is Mike Shine. I'm the CEO of Ocunova and NovaPharm, two startup companies. I spent the bulk of my career in large pharma. Actually, I spent about 27 years in large pharma, the last of which was with Wyeth prior to their acquisition by Pfizer. The last 9 years have been spent in the startup world.
That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you. My name is Bob Dolle, and I'm currently with Calvert Laboratories. We are one of the, senior members in the CRO preclinical market with over 50 years of experience. My experience, in addition to Calvert, goes back to various areas of both clinical trials, management, and companion diagnostics testing with Mayo Clinic, specialty laboratories, and Quest Diagnostics, as well as some high throughput testing with Genesis Biotechnology.
Well, that's a spectacular background there. Thanks very much indeed, Bob. And finally, Diane, please tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Diane Hershock. I'm a medical oncologist at the Penn State Cancer Institute in Hershey. I have spent about half my career in academic medicine, formerly at the Abramson Cancer Center of the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. And I also have clinical development experience on the pharmaceutical side. I've worked from phase 1 through phase 3 and some post-marketing trials in companies such as Sanofi Aventis, Merck, GSK, and Cephalon, which is now Teva Pharmaceuticals. So I am currently doing clinical trial development at the Penn State Cancer Institute.
Thanks very much indeed, Diane. And to round off the panel, just a bit about me. My name is Nick Spring, and I'm currently a partner at ALTEN Calsoft Labs, and I head up the life sciences there. Prior to that, actually, I've been a serial entrepreneur. I started my career at Smith & Nephew back in the UK. And then I went to Merck, where I worked actually in the animal health division, everything to do with cattle, sheep, pigs, cats, dogs. And then more latterly, I moved across into human health, into vaccines specifically. And from there, I left there and started my own company, Topaz Pharmaceuticals, where we developed and repurposed a drug called ivermectin to control head lice in kids. We took that from pre-IND through phase 1, 2, and 3, right to a successful PDUFA filing, an NDA. Luckily enough, I was able to sell that company to Sanofi. I then became a consultant to many different companies, and most recently was the CEO of a medical devices company, where again, we're involved with FDA regulations and clinical trials. Absolutely key critical to every single one of those ventures. So what we're going to do this afternoon, you can see now we've got quite a range of expertise covering everything from very, very big pharma right down to startups and growth companies. And what we're going to look at overall is, as a team we're going to talk about, is that what do you think about when you start to think about doing a trial? And each of the team members are going to address that. We're going to try and illustrate it, because this is practical knowledge, with real practical examples of what we've done or challenges we've faced and how we've overcome them. And then finally, we're going to also maybe talk about how a small company may address these versus a large company, and if we have time, where we think trial design will be going as we go into the future. So please, Mike, could you tell us a little bit of your adventures in trial design?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been primarily on the commercial side, Nick, and so my interactions with R&D and clinical development have been from the commercial perspective. But there's something I learned early on in my time with Wyeth that I think was quite helpful for me to understand the different phases of development in both large and small pharma. Wyeth developed an approach called learn and confirm, where the early phase development, phase 1 and phase 2, was really the time to learn about the drug that was in development, which populations it would be most appropriate for. And by the time you get to phase 3, that's the time to confirm. And so what I learned in that process is when you do a clinical study design, you always have to keep the end in mind. Am I trying to learn something from this trial, trying to learn something about the patients or the way the drug interacts in certain sub-patient population groups, or am I trying to confirm that I have the right dose for the right patient to reach the indication that I desire? And it reminded me of an experience I had with a small drug that was acquired from a startup company. And this company had actually studied their drug early on in end-of-life population. And so this was compelling data, and in order to get the first approval for this drug as a subcutaneous product, there was a phase 3 trial done in a population of patients that were undergoing palliative care. The results were spectacular, but the final label indication suggested that the drug could only be used for patients who had 6 months or less to live. Now, this is not a big commercial population, although it was for sure a medical need. And so the drug was beneficial to a certain patient population, but by not necessarily contemplating earlier in development who else, a broader population, this drug could appeal to, it actually ended up getting pigeonholed into this sort of palliative care use and never really broke out of it. So it taught me an important lesson that in the learn phase, if you have the opportunity to go broad and learn a lot about your drug and the patients that it will help, that's great. When you get to the confirm phase, you need to know that you have to design that trial, that phase 3 trial, with the end in mind, because what you study and how you study and who you study will be reflected in your label.
And what sort of challenges did you face being on the commercial side when you were dealing, say, with the clinical side in designing trials that may have a result that you wanted? What sort of challenges did you face, or frustrations, or problems did you have to solve?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's two approaches to that. The first approach is sort of the approach where R&D and the development team and the scientific group is very separate from the commercial team. And a commercial team will look at the commercial markets and really try and understand the potential of a drug to some extent without considering the actual scientific data, or considering the scientific data and then contemplating the broader uses of that. Perfectly appropriate. But if it's a commercial person, if I don't respect the science, if I don't follow the data and know where this drug has come from and who it works for, and I lose sight of that, it's going to lead to problems. I can actually cite an example of where commercial and our scientific teams worked incredibly well to actually take a drug that was performing so-so and make it really a blockbuster. And the example is in the PPI category, proton pump inhibitors. Back in the day, there were several. You may know them as Nexium and Prevacid and Prilosec, and a drug that we had at Wyeth called Protonix. And our commercial team became aware that nighttime GERD was a particular problem for patients. Some people would have no gastroesophageal reflux disease during the day, but at night they'd wake up frequently with this condition. And they collaborated with the scientific team, the R&D team, to determine if our drug would actually be able to help folks with nighttime GERD. This was not an indication that anyone had had prior to us doing that development program. So post-approval, we studied that group of patients and were able to expand the label to be the first and only drug approved for the treatment of nighttime GERD. It was an important patient population, it was important repositioning for the drug, and it was a beautiful example of how science and commercial identified an opportunity, demonstrated the drug could work for that group of patients, and created a label indication that separated it from a very crowded class of drugs.
And how, when you were, say, Big Pharma, did it differ in terms of getting priority for clinical trials and trial design versus, obviously, you're running smaller organizations today?
Yeah. How much time do we have for this panel, Nick?
You've got plenty of time.
Because that's a complicated story. I think in many respects, what I've learned is the large company, small company sort of fight for resources isn't all that different. It's just who you're asking for the funding.
Right.
And so in a large company, you may have a management team and several groups that are responsible for allocating funds for development programs. And effectively, you're pitching your programs relative to other research programs that are in play. In the small pharma startup world, you may not have multiple drugs competing for an already well-funded organization, but you're certainly competing for either venture capital funds, angel investment, or potential partnerships with large corporate entities. So although the mechanisms are a little bit different, the approach is still the same. You have to have a drug that shows a lot of promise, you have to have a unique differentiating proposition, and a scientific program that makes sense.
Thank you. That's excellent. And no doubt we'll be coming back to that subject. It's very pertinent. So let's move on to Bob. Please tell us your experiences with clinical trial design and the practical elements from really a CRO point of view.
Well, again, we're in the preclinical space,
Right.
which I realize today's topic is to talk about clinical trials.
Right.
But a successful clinical trial, and even moving on to clinical trial in humans, starts with the preclinical and planning. There are really three areas that I see that can become problematic when you're talking about designing your preclinical stage and your preclinical studies. And those three areas for pitfalls are in the planning, in the communication between the investigators and the company, the CRO, obviously that's performing the studies. And then the final area that I see presenting problems potentially is with pacing. Let's start with the planning, and to reiterate what Mike mentioned, you have to understand what your endpoint is. In this case, with preclinical testing and preclinical studies, you need to understand what you want out of your clinical trials. The obvious things, what method of delivery, dosing, things like that. Many of those will be determined during the preclinical phase, but you still have to have an idea of where you want to be with that. Otherwise, you can go down a million different roads and waste a lot of money, which when you're working with tight budgets is problematic. By planning properly and understanding, even down to the species of animal that you want to use. And this is where also the communication with the CRO comes in. There are many different, for instance, let's take vehicles for an example. There are many vehicles that may not be problematic in a human, but may cause issues in rodents or in dogs. And if you're not aware of that, you can very quickly, you start your study, and very quickly you start to see issues. And now, well, is it the vehicle? Is it the actual compound that we're looking at that's causing, say, gastrointestinal issues or hemolysis? Any number of different things that might be seen, and can shut down the study. In some cases may cause death of the animals, which shuts down the study. Now going back, you're starting from scratch. You're looking at at your dosing, you're looking at the formulation. So it can cause, and in the end it ended up it was just the vehicle that was the problem. In fact, there's a number of articles out there that can help you with determining those things.
So if I can ask you a question, so when you're dealing with your clients, and you must have a lot of war stories behind you,
I do.
which you probably can't talk about for privacy reasons. But however, how do you think that clients or people doing clinical trial design, even at the earliest stage, pre-IND, could get it much better than they are today?
I think, when you look at all three of those things, the pacing and such, which is driven many times by the investors. The communication really pulls it all together. You open up that dialogue with your CRO, and if you're open with them about the compound. Let me share an example. I guess.
Please.
And I have to be careful because of client confidentiality. So I'm going to pull like a compilation of things I have seen together into a worst case scenario. I've seen clients come to us. They don't need any dose formulation analysis done, so they share little about their compound. They're going to provide us, for instance, with the dose ready, say it's an oral compound. Dose ready, all you need to do is provide the dose to the animal and monitor. We have our own TK lab, so there's no need to, chemical structure and such. I've seen, as I mentioned, with the vehicle, a number of cases where the vehicle caused issues in the animal. So we know nothing about the compound. Again, lack of communication. Planning on their part, they're not aware that maybe there's a vehicle or in there that could be an issue. So we start dosing the animal, and then we start seeing emesis. We start seeing perhaps GI problems, liver problems. We come back, now they're under the gun. They're running both a small animal and a large animal simultaneously because the investor is pushing them to get data as quickly as possible. They want to move into human trials as quickly as possible. So forget about the normal sequence of events, which is to run your small animal first. You uncover any potential problems in a less expensive study in smaller animals before you move on to your large species, which can be dog, mini pig, and in some cases 2-3 times as costly as with a rat or a mouse study. So now you have both studies running simultaneously and potentially a vehicle, and I've seen this where it affects both species in similar ways. Now everything gets shut down. You don't really get the data you need to get. Go back, eventually the communication does come, and after the fact we find out, well, this was your vehicle, this was your problem. So now they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, upwards potentially of $1 million, to find out that, if they had picked a better vehicle in the beginning, maybe they would have been able to go through the studies, and now they have to do them all over again with the proper vehicle.
And how do you find, say, things like the client's obviously going to put, especially preclinical, under a lot of time pressure? They want the results as soon as possible.
Yes.
Their patent life is running out,
Yes.
and you're the first hurdle. So do you come across that at all, and pressure that way that affects trial design? Cutting corners, for instance?
Yes, cutting group sizes. Now, again, we'll provide it to you ready to go.
Right.
In some cases, we may be able to minimize some steps without it affecting, the design of the trial. It's very important when the data is going to be submitted. It doesn't necessarily have to be GLP. There are many exceptions that can be brought out in the report that can be overcome, but there has to be a lot of data behind the scenes that's already occurred, that you can provide to the FDA in order to have that accepted and have it, go through without being shut down.
Yep, that's great. All right, let's move along to Diane. That's very illustrative work so far. So, Diane, please tell us, what the importance of clinical trial design is when you're thinking about it.
So oncology clinical development is probably very different than any other aspect of development in any other drug arena. So from both the pharmaceutical side and the academic side, what you need to keep in mind with any trial development is really the patient, and the patient who is at the end of the spectrum. So many of the drugs that we're using in clinical development are in phase 1. Some of those are first-in-human drugs. And before you even embark on the road to development, you really need to understand the patient population that you're going into. These are patients who have been heavily pretreated with other standard of care medications. They've been on other clinical trials. And so whatever you're trying to develop is going to compete against some of what they've already received. And these are patients who are looking for hope. They're looking for hope that the drug that you're going to provide to them is actually going to be of benefit to them. And at this point, development in oncology is incredibly competitive, because there have been a lot of new and exciting things that have happened over the last 10 years, particularly in the immunotherapy space. And so when you go back to the preclinical side and you're thinking about developing a drug, there are a lot of candidate molecules that you have to sort through, that you have to decide what would work best for whatever tumor type you're thinking about. and you would look at cell lines. So for instance, melanoma, we would look at refractory cell lines to immunotherapy or other agents that we use in the treatment of melanoma. And we would see whether or not testing against those cell lines, the compound that we are putting into development works. And then after that, we get into the animal model and we start thinking about formulations. And you have to think about practical formulations, not just, are we going to give a pill? Will this be a capsule? Will our patient population be able to swallow it? Should this be IV? Should this not be IV, and why? But you give this to various animal models. You look at rodents as one. The FDA mandates that you use a non-rodent species as well. You look to see if there's any effect, which is incredibly important to know whether there's any efficacy inducing a tumor in that animal model and then giving this drug by whatever route of administration you decide to give it, just to look for effect. And if there's effect, then after that, you have to think about toxicology, whether this is going to be safe, whether there are going to be a lot of adverse events, the pharmacokinetics of this drug. How well does it behave once it gets into the body? How is it disposed of? A lot of our cancer patients have liver disease, they have kidney disease, and depending on how the drug gets metabolized, we have to sort of think about those routes, whether or not the liver can handle it, the kidney can, the biliary tract. And then we do toxicology studies, whether they be GLP or non-GLP. You have to find out whether or not there's going to be significant tox or adverse events that happen. And then we think about the formulation, then the manufacturing of that drug. Who's going to manufacture it? How is it going to be manufactured? When I was working at Cephalon, we had an early phase drug that was competing against a now approved drug by AbbVie called venetoclax. The drug that we had was unfortunately an IV formulation, and what this drug did was to work against the BCL2 pathway. So BCL2 prevents apoptosis in lymphoma cells in particular. What happened with this drug was that the formulation of it actually killed the drug. So unlike venetoclax, which is an oral agent, this was an IV agent that was very difficult to get into solution. It was in some type of red substance that would stain the patients, that would ruin their veins, and it would actually put them to sleep because it had mu receptor properties, or it acted like an opiate. And even though it did inhibit BCL2 and it had promise, we did early phase studies, both in animal models, and then we took it into humans in an early phase 1 in various hematologic malignancies. The formulation of this drug actually killed it. And it's unfortunate because it had the same properties as venetoclax. So when you're designing molecules and designing formulations and designing administration, those things have to be taken into account. And then once you get some pharmacokinetic data, you have efficacy data, you have toxicology data, then you think about putting together an IND and taking it forward into humans. And then the fun begins in terms of how you design your phase 1 trial. Again, keeping in mind the end game that you want to get a label for this drug.
Can I just ask you a question on it, Diane? I mean, you're raising a lot of, I think, very good, essential questions. When you say that you're communicating with people, who do you think, when you're looking at, say, a trial design, and you've covered things like manufacturing, formulation, we've heard about commercial, who do you think makes up a perfect team to interact, to think about the trial design? Who would you like to see in that group?
So normally from the pharmaceutical side, when we put together a team, clinical development is the driver of all of this. But we have people from discovery on the team. So some of the preclinical folks who do the PK data, who do the formulation, but we have early phase 1 oncologists who are involved in thinking about the design. We have operation folks. So these are people who are actually going to help execute the trial. So we see whether it makes sense to them or not, how we want to design the trial. They're very involved in it. The regulatory people are also very much involved in terms of deciding how the FDA may look at the data, how they're going to look at the IND package. We actually have commercial people who sit at the table in those early phase talks so that we can get the commercial buy-in. And even though, again, as Mike sort of said, they're really not part of the initial design in terms of phase 1. They really are part of it because they're looking too at the end game and whether or not this will be commercially viable. We don't want to develop a drug in a patient population that makes no sense just to develop a drug, and then we get to the end of phase 3 and we have no commercial market. And that has actually happened with the drug that I worked on as well at Cephalon. The same sort of thing happened, and we got it approved, but there was no market for it because of the way in which the drug was given. And so commercial is very, very viable at that point. And we have our CRO partners, so if we can't do the work in-house, our CRO partners are also at the table helping with the design of this trial, unless it's big pharma. So big pharma tends to use CROs a little bit less than the biotechs, but again, the CROs are really our arms and legs from the pharmaceutical side. And so they are also thinking about the type of patient that we're going to be using, whether patients will be compliant, whether we'll be able to recruit to this study, whether there is a patient population. So it's a huge team when we decide we're going to develop a drug and go forward with it.
Okay, well thanks. What I'm going to do is I just relate my little war story, and then I'm going to open up to the panel and ask a number of different questions as we've sort of touched on different aspects from different points of view. So my experience of trial design really factors into two areas. One, I was in the commercial area, as I mentioned, at Merck, and amusingly, things like animal studies, which are part of trial design, can be very interesting. This is for animal health products, and I particularly remember a product, if you've ever tried to inject a 1,000-pound cow and she doesn't want to, then you've got a problem. So we decided to develop a formulation where you could just pour it along the back. And that was very important, and the trial design went ahead. We did a bunch of trials, only to discover that the formulation actually made all the hair at the back of the cow fall out, so she ended up with a little bald spot, apart from that. But more practically, when I was actually running my own pharma company, which has started Topaz Pharmaceuticals back in 2005, we were, as I mentioned before, redirecting a product called ivermectin, which had a huge history of controlling eye worms, river blindness, that Merck had given away philanthropically. Also been used extensively in animals, had a great safety profile. And we were repurposing it to use on a 505(b)(2) to control head lice in kids. And I suppose it's a little bit amusing. So as the CEO running this company, and we raised money from venture capital, you're conscious of two things. One, you have no revenue coming in, and you've got a lot of money burning. I see Mike nodding away there, disappearing. So a pressure on you undoubtedly is to get your trials done as efficiently and as quickly as possible. So we had 3 phases of trials, but the interesting story, and I'm going to ask actually each of you for this too, is we came across an unexpected event actually in patient recruitment. And although we'd done the trial design, in fact, we usually went and negotiated the protocols with the FDA, got it all agreed, came back, started the thing. We actually discovered that head lice actually had a very, very big issue to do with stigma. And in fact, it's interesting, I used to start meetings by saying, who's heard of head lice? Put your hands up. Everybody would. And then you say, have you ever had a friend who's had head lice? And half the hands would go down. And then you say, keep your hands up if you've ever had head lice, and oddly enough, the room would be completely barren. So one of the problems we had actually is with recruitment, and I wanted to go back to the group in a second, because I think there's 2 areas that are really coming forward today. And one's patient consent, and the other one's recruitment of patients that are relevant to your trial. We ran into major patient recruitment problems because no parents were really that willing to admit their kids had head lice. And it tends to be a pediatrically oriented problem to begin with. So although that's not a particularly serious contraindication, it certainly slowed us down. And I'm going to the other side of this. When you do, so one part of the equation is you do a trial design. and it's there and it looks great, and off you go and try to execute. And then you're 2 months into the trial, and somehow your patient recruitment's fallen back, which is a story I hear again and again and again. So think of that when you're doing trial design, patient recruitment, patient consent, patient confidentiality. Have you seen any changes? I'll start with you, Diane, this time.
So patient recruitment can be difficult. So from an oncologist perspective, many of our patients still have the mentality of being used as, quote, guinea pigs. They believe these are experimental drugs, which they are, and that instead of offering them standard of care, which they probably already had, they feel that, you know, they are being used as an experiment themselves. And so the mentality trying to get patients to realize that a lot of the drugs that are in development at this point have been very, very well thought out and designed in the preclinical space. So by the time they get into phase 1, you have at least proof of principle. Phase 1s are proof of concept, but there is efficacy data that we can provide to those patients to try to show them, yes, that there is some benefit. But it's been very difficult getting many of these patients to consent to clinical trials. We're still less than 10% from an oncologic perspective, which is rather unusual because the immunotherapy drugs themselves, many patients in phase 1 had responses, which was in the past relatively unusual. And so trying to get them to understand that you could be getting something like Keytruda or Opdivo that would benefit them in phase 1 is still a little difficult. But a lot of it has to do with how the data is presented to them, the physician, and the trust that they have with their physician in terms of the recruitment of those patients.
Right.
Sometimes we do, though, have to be a little bit more creative in terms of advertising, the trial, that sort of thing. And I know beyond phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, it sometimes becomes a little bit more difficult to recruit to those trials because, again, patients want whatever is the, quote, standard that's going to fix them. You know, these are still relatively unknown, but by the time they get to phase 2 or phase 3, generally we have some safety data, we have some efficacy data. But again, you know, patients have to really understand that there may be a true benefit to them and that they're not being used in an experimental fashion.
Mike, what do you think?
So one of the first drugs we worked on and one of the first categories we worked in was a rare disease space. And again, when you talk about challenges of enrolling patients in trials, when you develop drugs for rare diseases, you're already starting with a very small population. And one of the really important things that I think a lot of companies are doing more of now that perhaps in the past they weren't is engaging with patient advocate groups. These are critical groups of patient advocates, I'll call them, or organizations.
Things like patients like me, that type of thing?
Or specifically the example is we were working on a condition called complex regional pain syndrome, and there's a patient advocacy group called the RSDSA, and this group was responsible not only for raising awareness because it's a rare disease and many people that get the disease don't know what it is, but they were also very instrumental in helping us or helping people that have this disease know that there's clinical trials that are being planned or ongoing that they could potentially enroll in. And so advertising and working with CROs, and there's a number of things that I think are standard in our industry which you have to follow. It's the blocking and tackling, as they say. But involving patient advocacy groups and identifying those patient advocacy groups that are really about patient-driven awareness of disease conditions and new treatments that might be available have become really great partnerships for drug companies. And if I may, for 1 second, just pivot back to something Diane said.
Please.
I think even in clinical trial design, we're seeing companies today now start to involve patients early in the clinical design process. That patient journey you talked about the life of an oncology patient, when clinical scientists who spend a lot of time, designing trials and running numbers and looking at statistical analysis actually get to see a patient's journey with their cancer, or in our case with the rare disease, or even in the ophthalmic drug we're working on, it enlightens you remarkably that dose and method of delivery and participation in a trial and concomitant drugs and just what your day looks like are important considerations when you're starting to think about trial design. So I think, and even FDA, FDA these days is now bringing patient advocacy groups in when they're contemplating new drugs and having advisory panels. And so I think that shift of having the patients with the disease more involved with drug companies, with patient advocacy group, and even with the regulatory authorities has really closed a seam that existed for a long time in drug development so that we can consider early on what a patient's life is like before and potentially after they're on the medication we're developing.
That's great. So Bob.
And don't mean to interrupt, we do have a question from the audience.
Oh,
I can
please.
share it with you.
Yes.
So this is regarding patient recruitment, and it's a good point about difficult participant recruitment. One stumbling block today is the lack of true anonymity and privacy, and how sharing their health info outside their own doctors might have risks to their own health insurance, employment, etc. Is there any way to address this issue?
So this is to do with patient privacy and other information. Mike?
Yeah,
So
well, what I would say, I'm not an expert in that space, so I don't have I wish I had a snap answer that would satisfy the question. But what I will tell you is, I think this is where selection of a CRO, particularly if you're a small company, is critically important. There's a lot of CRO. I think I'm going to lead into Bob right now. I'm giving him a few seconds to think about it. But in all honesty, I do think we've relied a great deal on CROs for a lot of our trials since we have been in the startup phase.
Right.
And I think some CROs are miles ahead of others in terms of managing patient privacy information, being aware of how to do that. And I'll just make one other comment about that. We're actually getting some data from European sites for a trial that was recently completed, and we've had to establish a U.S. privacy shield, which puts the onus on us to make sure that any data that we have, be it from clinical trials or even sites that are used in clinical trials, when that data comes from Europe to us, it has to be protected by a U.S. privacy shield, which requires us to have a secure server, and again, puts us on the line for protecting that data. So I think to the person that asked the question, getting a CRO that has some of those things already built in is important, but then realizing if you're in a company or an academic environment and you're going to be handling some of the sensitive data, things are shifting to where you have to have full accountability for that.
Let's come back to that, because one of the notes I made earlier was the impact of doing trials overseas, and that's obviously relevant to that. But Bob, I mean, you're right in the middle of this, and you've had
yes
at
and
least
no.
3 minutes to think about the answer.
Yes and no. I can answer this from two perspectives. First of all, fortunately, being in the preclinical space, we don't have an issue recruiting patients and keeping them compliant. So, when there is something to be said for working with rodents and dogs and mini pigs. But from a CRO perspective, I can tell you that looking at just Calvert, we wouldn't be in this business for 50 years if we weren't extremely confidential in our details, in working with our clients, in keeping information within the proper channels. Our reputation would very quickly turn to dust if we had any questions, any issues whatsoever. And we're not even dealing with human patient information. We're just, keeping client confidentiality. So, if you're dealing with a CRO that has a track record, a strong history, they have certain standards that they have to live up to, or they wouldn't be successful. They wouldn't be in the industry for any amount of time.
Right. So let me just throw it a little wider then, because I think that as the pressure comes on to do more and more trials, and the agencies are becoming more concerned about safety and efficacy, and the size that you have to do trials is increasing, which is putting the pressure on everyone to start doing, and it's already happened, more and more trials overseas. Okay. So what sort of challenges do you think we face overall by this trend, both in terms of privacy and proper patient consent and good data? I'll hand that over to Diane.
So having worked on trials both U.S. and ex-U.S., so Europe, South America, Central America, and Asia-Pac, the European rules in terms of privacy are very similar to the United States. So although they don't have HIPAA, they essentially adhere to HIPAA. In other countries, it's a little bit different, but I can tell you that most companies, again, protect patient privacy extremely well. The patients are assigned a separate number that we can link to the patient, but it's not obvious to anyone who's handling any of the data that comes in. In terms of doing clinical trials ex-US, there are clearly differences in the way in which some trials are managed overseas. So remember that in the United States, we're very privileged in terms of what we are exposed to in terms of medicine and what is the state of the art at this point. In some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe and other places in the world, they are not so privileged to have what we consider standard of care. And so going on a clinical trial for them may be the only way in which they would gain access to more novel agents, particularly in the oncology space. The standard of care in terms of the medical care of these patients varies greatly amongst all countries outside the US and Western Europe, except for...
So can I just interrupt slightly there, Diane? So how does that affect the quality of the data you're getting and also statistically the type of patient you're getting? I mean, is that...
So when we write clinical trials, there are particular eligibility criteria that we build into a trial. So not all patients are equal and can go on a clinical trial, especially if they have some pre-existing issues with diabetes or heart disease, depending on how many lines of treatment they have had, what types of toxicities they had from prior treatment. So there are what we call inclusion-exclusion criteria. And outside the US and Western Europe, trying to get some sites to adhere to those inclusion-exclusion criteria can be difficult. So some of the patients that do get enrolled may have been too sick to be on some of these clinical trials, have other pre-existing issues that would have precluded them from being on a clinical trial. And the management of some of the toxicities that happen because of the drug in development is not the same as in the United States. And so that the health care that some of these patients get in terms of taking care of them if they get hospitalized is very different. And so we sometimes see more adverse events happen outside the United States. The way in which they're managed may be more difficult, and patients may end up dying when they may not have died, depending on the type of care they've gotten. They may not have access to that care. So there are patients in Asia Pacific who live hundreds of miles from the site in which they're being treated, and they don't have access to be taken care of should they have toxicities from the trials. And so that can affect the outcome of the trial. The safety profile could be worse. The death rate may be higher, not because they're dying of the disease, but they're dying from the toxicity of the disease because it wasn't adequately managed. And so when you're selecting sites, you have to be very careful in terms of whether or not patients themselves will have access to not only the drug, the experimental drug, but also taking care of them if there are any side effects or any other issues that may occur because of that.
So basically we're saying that trial design is of key importance to many fundamental aspects of our business. So about the last 10 minutes, I was just wondering, and it might be helpful for the audience as well. So we've talked about the past, we talked about the present. Why don't we focus ourselves a little bit on crystal ball gazing and say what's going to be happening in the future? And an area, for instance, that I find particularly interesting is the intersection of technology and wearables and all these things that I think are going to affect the way that trials are designed, data's collected as we go forward. So I'll put Bob on the spot this time, as our CRO do, and say, you know, you're right in the middle. You're actually at the earliest stage of design. And as you've, I mean, for instance, an issue you must be facing all the time, at least in the Western world, is to have less and less animal-based experiments. And I've seen a radical change over the years for that. How do you see that developing? And also broadening it out, when you start looking at phase 1, 2, and 3, How do you think new technology is going to affect the way the trials are designed, and what's the benefits, do you think, to sponsors going forward?
We've already seen a shift in the European area, for instance, in trying to use less animal studies. It's a catch-22. You know, it really is. It's a little scary on one hand. You know, how many people would want to be the first volunteer to have a drug that's not gone through, say, you know, the ultimate goal of some of these groups are to have no animal testing. I know I would.
That's achievable?
It's scary to think that, you know, there'd have to be a whole lot of data available that I don't know that we even could provide. You know, given the ability to connect all the research that's been done, even on any specific disease or chemical compound. It's a little bit scary. I'm sure there are algorithms that can start to look at potential problems and perhaps even predict certain, you know, successes with certain chemicals. But at the end of the day, when any chemical, any entity, any compound enters a living body, whether it's human or any other species, there are so many factors just within that individual body that can affect the metabolism, toxicity of that compound. I would guess that it's going to take an awful long time and a lot of technology to get to that point, and I don't know that
So you're not really seeing a change in the much, not beyond the trends we already have. So, but if you were to look through the lens of the actual trials themselves, the phase 1, 2, and 3, what changes do you think you might be able to see there, looking forward?
I think the ability to capture and analyze data is going to be a key. Pulling information from multiple sources, not just a specific group or company that's doing the current work, but perhaps there was other historical data and information. And I know everybody keeps things close to the vest for patent reasons and such, and that's important. But there's a lot of data, I think, that is available, that if we were to capture that properly, we could avoid a lot of potential problems.
Well, what do you think, Mike? You're nodding away then.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think between wearable technology, the ability to do real-time instant data transfer, and even remote medicine and remote diagnosis are all factors that I think are going to lend themselves to enhancing clinical trial design and enable us to reach patients that we couldn't in the past. Back in the early 2000s even, there were places in the West that you couldn't recruit patients for because they'd have to travel 40 miles to a study site. And now those patients are accessible with remote medicine, remote monitoring. So I think data collection for sure. I also believe that, to another point that I think Bob raised, is this notion of, we've heard about personalized medicine for a very long time, and I'm not sure where personalized medicine will end up, but I do think that we're seeing more and more of this shrinking of a population from large blockbuster, this drug's good for everybody, to narrowing down populations based on a lot of factors, including genetic factors, to really understand
that, I mean, you anticipated where I was going to go. I think it's a really interesting area. So there's been a lot of talk about people owning their own data, bodies, genetics. And in fact, we're having the ability to sell that back to interested parties. How do you think, building on your idea there, that's going to affect clinical trial design moving forward?
Personally, I think it's inevitable that, you know, knowing your DNA, you know, your unique particular DNA and gene responses and your risk factors, it's building. And so I think the more we have, just from a purely scientific standpoint, the more information we have about that, the better we're going to be able to design drugs for really complex vexing diseases, genetic-driven diseases, et cetera. So I do believe it's inevitable, and I do have just seen this slow, long shift of patients taking more responsibility for their own health, healthcare, and treatment options. And so in order to do that, you need knowledge. We still have a long way to go to protect that data. That was a great question that was brought up by someone in the audience. because that's still a big fear that people have. They want to know their own genetic predispositions and risk factors, but they don't want anybody else to know it for insurance reasons and elsewhere. But again, I think that's shifting because you can't have one without the other.
Although, just to be clear, the insurance issue isn't a particularly US issue.
For sure.
Centralized healthcare systems, it isn't. You know, Diane, you're dealing with oncology, and as genomics moves forward and the identity of, cancer-causing genes, etc., it becomes more and more apparent. How do you think that's going to affect you? The point of view, and I've seen it, that your patients are going to be able to own their own genes, and they will release it to you only for a fee. And ironically, the rarer your disease, the more valuable potentially you can be. How do you think that's going to, in a practical sense, affect recruitment into your trials, which you've already said is difficult to begin with? You now have a population that can volunteer or not to come in.
Well, it is difficult. So if somebody knows if they have a genetic predisposition to a certain cancer, they're certainly followed. But a lot of the cancers that we deal with are really somatic hits. So these are not necessarily passed down from generation to generation, even though we have many of those. A lot of them, we find out what the mutation is once they're diagnosed with the cancer. And then we can select out to an appropriate trial because, again, as you mentioned, targeted therapy, precision medicine, personalized medicine is really a tremendous focus of oncology. And so we look at the mutational landscape of most people's cancers independent of whether they know if they have a genetic predisposition, because things can change. And a lot of drug development now is in that realm. So it becomes more difficult to recruit because if you don't have a particular mutation, such as, let's say, an NTRK mutation, which is incredibly rare, but there are drugs out there that are working against that mutation, it makes development and recruitment to those trials very cumbersome, long, and it can take an incredible amount of time, which is not what pharma wants. I mean, at this point, the drive of clinical development on the pharmaceutical side is faster to market because there's so much competition in the space. And so the luxury that we used to have of a 10-year clinical development path from phase 1 through phase 2 through phase 3 through approval doesn't exist anymore. It's less than 5 years. And in fact, most companies want it to be 2 to 3 years, which again, if you have a specific mutation, that can be incredibly difficult trying to find those patients
just
to recruit.
go to the other end of that. So you raise a very good point. So undoubtedly, the pressure on all drug companies, doesn't matter small, large, or medium size, is speed to market.
Yeah.
Okay. And efficiency. So what's your view, Diane, on non-interventional ways of collecting data, like digital wearables, wireless connection to patients, that type of thing? Have you seen that begin to come in at all? Is it an effect? Or is it a dream?
So we're starting to see a little bit of it, but again, it becomes, there are issues with it in terms of protection of that data. And so there's a lot of controversy about it. But yes, that probably may be a route to help as we go forward, but
Right.
it's...
Well, and then managing that data.
And yes.
There's an we obviously in the preclinical space, for instance, our cardiovascular testing, we're using telemetered animals. And so they're continuously monitored, and the amount of data that a study like that can generate, I can only imagine in a human setting, how much more can potentially be made available, and gathering, compiling, analyzing all that data is a huge task.
Well, actually, building on that, another trend I've noticed is the ability to analyze, chemically, electrophoresis, etc., has increased. The sensitivities have increased. So endpoints now have become more and more difficult to achieve, especially if you're looking for certain, say, no drug in the blood. 40 years ago, you might have had point X. Today, detectors can go logarithmically over that. In fact, I experienced that with my company in the 25 years since ivermectin was first introduced. The blood endpoints had changed largely as a result of the ability to detect stuff. Have you found that at all a problem in practical sense, that you're getting more and more demands from the agencies, etc., to prove something that may or may not be there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where this concept of big data and managing big data and having a statistical analysis approach to your data is critically important no matter what phase you're in, because statistics really now can tell a great deal more than I think we knew in the past. So, I think to an extent the agencies haven't, in my experience at least, haven't changed dramatically, but I do think the pressures are there as those markers move, as the requirements to really provide statistical analysis for all of your studies, as that demand becomes higher. It just is something you have to be aware of when you're designing your trials. It's not binary, it's not single endpoints, it's single endpoints plus risk factors, plus analysis, plus data points. So data management, data synthesis, and statistical analysis, I think there's more pressure than ever on that.
Yeah, an interesting trend I've seen, and I'm working on it directly, so I have to claim an interest in this, is the introduction of blockchain technologies, which collect data immutably with a complete record. And actually, the surprising thing to me, and the reason I got very interested in this from a clinical study point of view, was the rapid uptake in product supply. Supply chain, the fact that you can go right back to origination of key components, right through to when the patient, I mean, have you seen the technology from Proteus, the pill where you swallow it and you can instantly record it on a cell phone, the date, time, etc. So I'm seeing that in clinical trials, potentially, you could get technology like this, where data could go straight to the regulatory authorities. It would shorten the time considerably, because you wouldn't be collecting massive spreadsheets, having to scrub them, submit them. Do you think this sort of technology will be useful to the industry? Because one trend I got very well just a moment ago is we're getting inundated with data, and you can get into an analysis paralysis after a while. What data is really important? But going back to things like blockchain technologies, do you see that as something that will be on the horizon that people might start using?
I mean, I think all data is good data, right? All data is good data. It's how you look at it and where it takes you. I don't really understand the blockchain technology application to pharmaceuticals, but I certainly think there's a lot of wisdom in being able to track a drug from API through, frankly, through excretion in the patient.
Correct.
To understand what's happening to that drug and how it's being metabolized. So again, I think our industry's always been data-driven. I think it's always been analytical, and I think to a large extent, anything that will enable that to happen faster or better, because as Diane pointed out, the pressures are there to get drugs to market faster, will help us. And so again, I think like we're seeing in society, we're seeing this constellation of changes where certain areas like statistical analysis and modeling and tracking and blockchain technologies are finding their way into traditional industries like pharmaceuticals.
Okay. Well, I just sneakily looked at my watch and saw that it's 1 minute past 1.
That's okay, we have some more time.
Oh, we got more time. I was going to ask people.
So we do have another question.
Oh, we got another question.
Yeah, so how do you think, looking at crystal balls, how do you think retailers are going to be disruptive potentially to clinical trials and patient recruitment, such as the CVSs that are now administering vaccines and having nurse practitioners, Walmart's announcing their healthcare clinics that have access to, a significant portion of the American population, but then even maybe someone like Amazon with their Haven, and now they have access to all of this consumer data, very data-driven. Do you see them potentially being disruptive to patient recruitment?
I'll loop in myself and go with this one. It's an area of particular keen interest. I think the delivery, and we talked about personalized medicine, another big trend we're seeing is the delivery of medicine to people through non-traditional channels, when you start looking at things like MinuteClinic and things like that. And I was actually at a CEO lunch with the CEO from Blue Cross Blue Shield was talking, and it's their intention to get delivery to every patient in the USA within a 15-minute drive of that patient. And we're seeing more and more of the intrusion of telemedicine, for instance. So you are getting all of this other data, which you can correlate through things like Amazon, what people are buying, what they're eating, etc., what they are doing, and where they are geographically. I don't know whether anybody here has been onto my Google, but it's pretty darn scary, the information that they collect. So I know that companies are looking at this as a methodology to backtrack. And I mean, even on things like your cell phone and things, you get you talk about individualized medicine, we already see individualized advertising. So it's no great shakes if you're over the age of 65 and somebody's trying to recruit for 65-year-olds and beyond, that you will start to see ads rolling through on your smartphone if you're over 65 for that particular trial. So that's my view on it. What do other people think?
I don't think it's going to be disruptive. That specific example you cited, Eric, I don't think is going to be disruptive to clinical trials, but I do agree wholeheartedly with Nick when it comes to delivery of medicines that are approved. Consumers are going to have an abundant number of options, from retail options to telemedicine to direct delivery from pharmaceutical companies or their healthcare provider. And I think what's going to happen as a result of that is we're going to see an impact on the price of medicines. So I actually think it's a good thing because competition's always good for the end consumer. And I think them having many options in how to source their medicines, where to get them from, will drive costs down. It will certainly put some pressure on the pharmaceutical industry, but I think it's an appropriate pressure because those technologies and those abilities to get medicines should be consumer-based.
But I think actually one of the interesting points that Erica brought up through that question, it's an excellent question, is, you know, when you look at people like CVS, who have not only data on what you're being scripted, but every other buying behavior you have whilst you're in that environment, maybe even beyond if they're using tracking cookies and things like that, because all the CVS cards are now gone electronic. The ability for them to sell to sponsors or CROs, the ability to target certain people, like you can imagine going in to get your medicine, and because you've got one or two that are interesting comorbidities or indicator morbidities, you could be selected and given think, hey, have you thought about being on this trial?
Yeah, for sure.
What do you
That's a
think,
good point.
Diane?
Well, we've already had a discussion about privacy.
Right.
This is a huge invasion of a patient's privacy.
It
If we're
is.
going to be, but I mean, I can understand on the one hand, but your privacy is just, but we have at Penn State, we have a difficult time recruiting patients to trials because of distance. We cover about a 28-county area in central Pennsylvania, extending into Appalachia. And so I think from a recruitment perspective, this would actually be in our favor, but I worry about the types of people who work at CVS, Walgreens, in terms of managing these patients. They certainly, especially oncology. Oncology is, incredibly difficult to manage in person, more or less. If you're not well trained and you're not oncology savvy, dealing with an oncology patient through a CVS or dispensing drugs through CVS and trying to manage it would be difficult. But I think, recruitment, it sounds great. I worry about the privacy.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point on privacy, and the other big issue, having worked on a number of international things, is the rules for privacy are fundamentally different from the US, say, to Europe. Where actually the level of privacy in the US is relatively low, whereas in Europe everybody theoretically owns their own data. So I think it's a very good question that you raised. How are we doing for time? We've got time for another?
Yep.
Okay. So when you're, just backtracking actually to a point that Diane raised when she was talking about, the perfect team to think about making a trial. I'm going to direct this one to you, Mike. So you're on the commercial side, and you may relate to this because I was on it as well. Often we would get drugs, by the time they got through to us to comment on, the formulation and the manufacturing had already been decided. And we go, oh my goodness, why? So how do you view when's the right time for the formulation and manufacturing to happen? Because early stage manufacturing is obviously very connected to formulation. And then I'm going to ask Diane the other side of the coin. So you're going to have the commercial and the thing. And Bob, you chip in as wish, because you're stuck in the middle, right? The formulation's coming out of the lab. You got to test it. These guys are going, oh my goodness, have we tested this yet? So what's your experience of that? And what's the ideal time for formulation to be decided and how?
Yeah, I mean, I think early in my career, It was a much more traditional pharmaceutical time when those decisions, as you very well alluded to, you get all of the drug developed and then you get it thrown over the wall to the commercial guy that says, run a forecast, and by the way, it needs to look like this. And you say, well, I'm sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. Later in my career, right before I left Wyeth, and I actually think this enabled me to have a lot of confidence to start my own company, leaving a big pharmaceutical company. We had moved to a model where we brought formulation, manufacturing, R&D, and commercial all together on a single team. It was a joint team led by R&D and commercial. And yeah, there was a little bit of healthy tension about pulling into market directions and contemplating how patients would be dosed and what the competitive landscape was. But it was super healthy competition because it also opened my eyes a lot to some of the limitations that formulation and manufacturing had. I am with you 100%, Nick. There were days when you get that drug with its profile lobbed over the wall and all you could say is, who in the world came up with this? Once you're on one of those teams where all members of the team are sitting around the table and are jointly incentivized to get the drug to market, you see crystal clear why certain formulation decisions were made. Now, doesn't mean I agreed with them, but I understood them. And by understanding them, you can help, I think, impact earlier on in the process what elements need to be baked in. And I'm sure Bob will comment on this because he already has about excipients and different agents that are used in a formulation and the side effects. If you're a commercial guy and you don't understand that, when you get a formulation and it's ready to go into phase 3, there's a huge gap in expectations and in modeling. So I guess my best advice is, whether you're a tiny startup or you work in a large pharmaceutical company, or even if you're in the academic world, build a team where you contemplate formulation, manufacturing, commercial, and the research stuff all together as early as possible.
And that's key critical to trial design. I mean, Diane, Bob, do you want to weigh in on what was being said?
So generally, in my previous life, we would start thinking about formulation issues probably midway during the preclinical development. So we already had an idea this is going to go into man or into patients. And because manufacturing takes so long, so when you finally come up with a formulation, you're 6 months to a year in manufacturing, looking at stability, making sure that there are not temperature excursions, all of that. So the conversation, I agree, has to start early. And I really believe at that point that there should be clinician buy-in, at least, thinking about whether a patient is going to be able to tolerate this. The route of administration is important because IV sometimes is actually better than oral because of compliance issues. A lot of patients will forget to take drugs, or it's just too difficult to get the amount of drug that you need in a capsule.
And by clinician, you mean actually going out into the real world rather than just within the company clinician?
Well, so at that point, having the sort of the patient advocate route is not always a bad idea, to at least get some kind of buy-in as to whether a patient would take this or not. But even so, if you already have a sense of what your dose might start at, and you're going to build a pill or a capsule because this is an oral formulation, you have to think about how much drug you're going to be giving and how much needs to go into that capsule or pill, what size the capsules are, whether it can be opened or not, whether or not there's a food effect because some patients, again, can't swallow and they're going to mix it with something, what those excipients are. Because sometimes the excipients are actually the cause of the adverse event rather than the active ingredient itself. And so, if you can start talking about formulation early on and have the R&D team, the commercial team involved in those discussions early on, because it is going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference how we develop it, how fast we can move it up in phase 1, what doses we start at. Are we only going to have one dose size, or are we going to have multiple doses? And again, that's important. And the IV formulation, is it soluble? Is it insoluble? I mean, we've killed drugs based on insolubility. No matter what we put something in, there was no way we could give it to a patient because what it was in was going to affect the patient, not so much the API itself.
So what about you, Bob? You actually started this particular debate because you were talking about the vehicle.
I
thought
guess
you were talking
so.
about cars to begin with, and I realized you had to sit in the vehicle.
It's the transportation that gets your compound where you need it to go. From our perspective, we're the ones that we see the result of formulation changes. and be it a lack of planning initially, because we're the ones that, when phase 1 human trials bring about potential issues, now it has to come back to the animal studies again. So from a development perspective, from a cost perspective, from a timing perspective, getting it right earlier in the process makes a lot of sense, because then now from a selfish standpoint, I say go ahead, because that's more studies we're going to end up getting down the road as you go through the process and have to keep adjusting the formulation. But putting my medical hat and the good of the patient hat back on, certainly it really does make sense to get it done earlier. And for the sake of the company, they're not burning through money and going through the process multiple times before they get it right.
Okay, so unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end. Time's flown, and I want to thank the panel big time. But I'm going to ask the panel just one final thing, which is thinking of importance of clinical trial designs. This is the challenge. In 5 words or less, what point would you like to leave our erudite audience with in terms of thinking through importance of clinical trial design?
Start with the end in mind.
So I'm going to come full circle back to what I talked about: planning, communication, and pacing.
Fantastic. Diane, 5 words or less?
Precision, thought, exact population.
Excellent. I'm going to skip it because I can't talk in but I'd just like to thank the panel big time, Mike, Bob, and Diane. And just top line, I think we covered a lot of ground today in this practical series. We've tried to be as practical as possible. Hopefully everybody's enjoyed that. And we really covered a lot of stuff. I think we've got a great panel with a big, broad range of experience from big company to small company. And a little conclusion we came to there was challenges tend to be similar in all of them. We looked at the history of where we come from. We looked at what was happening now. And I think very importantly, we started to look about things that are going to affect us into the future. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed. This is from Nick Spring, reporting from BioStrategy Partners, Center City, Philadelphia.